Imagine being born surrounded by power, but also by danger. Imagine being just a baby and already at the center of one of England's greatest controversies. Now imagine all of this as a woman. Yes, this was the childhood of Elizabeth Tudor, better known to us as Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. But before she became a legend, she was just a little red-haired girl with lively eyes and an uncertain destiny. Hey, if you love stories that seem like they came out of a Netflix series but that actually happened, subscribe to the channel, give it a smart like, and comment on what surprises you most in this story. Elizabeth's court is just beginning to reveal itself. It all began in 1533, when the powerful King Henry VIII, a headstrong, impulsive man obsessed with having a son, decided to break with the entire Catholic Church just so he could marry Anne Boleyn, a woman with a strong, ambitious personality, and unlike any he had ever known. And from this union was born Elizabeth. But her birth wasn't exactly a national celebration. The king desperately wanted a male heir, someone to carry on the throne and the Tudor family name. When he learned it was a girl, Henry tried to show joy, but inside it felt as if fate had played a cruel trick. Anne Boleyn, who had risen to the top with charm, intelligence, and political maneuvering, began to lose her place at court. Under pressure for not giving the king a son, she became the target of gossip, intrigue, and false rumors. And in 1536, she was accused of adultery and treason. The result, she was beheaded on a cold morning in the Tower of London. Elizabeth, then just 2 years and 8 months old, lost her mother and her title of princess in the same blow. From then on, she was referred to simply as Lady Elizabeth. This may not seem like a big deal today, but at the time, being removed from the line of succession was like being erased from history. And yet, she survived. She grew up as a silent observer at court, watching her father marry 6 times, learn Latin, read philosophy, and form a brilliant mind, even when everything indicated she would be just a footnote. But fate, as you'll see in this story, loves to surprise. And while everyone was betting against her, Elizabeth was just waiting for her time to shine. Now you might be wondering, how did someone who was practically excluded from the throne end up becoming one of England's greatest queens? After the brutal death of her mother, Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth not only lost her mother figure, she was also officially removed from the line of succession. Her own father, King Henry VIII, signed documents declaring that Elizabeth was no longer legitimate to occupy the throne. The red-haired little girl, once called a princess, was now simply Lady Elizabeth, a cold title for someone born into royalty. She was removed from court, raised far from the ballrooms and royal banquets, and left to live under the care of tutors and ladies-in-waiting. But here's the most impressive part. Instead of being consumed by neglect, Elizabeth immersed herself in books. She learned Latin, Greek, French, studied mathematics, music, history, and philosophy. She read as if the world depended on it, and in a way, it did. While other children played in the palace gardens, Elizabeth grew up quietly, sharpening her mind like a blade, observing the behavior of those around her, and understanding how power truly worked. She learned early on that in a male-dominated world, intelligence could be her only weapon. And the throne? Well, it seemed increasingly distant. Her father had fathered a son with another wife, little Edward VI, who was now the official heir. And then there was her older half-sister, Mary Tudor, a devout Catholic who had viewed Elizabeth with suspicion since she was a child. In other words, for England at that time, Elizabeth was just a spare piece in the game. And yet, she never behaved like a disposable person. On the contrary, even though she lived in the shadows, she began to be seen as someone brilliant, charismatic, and cunning. Many nobles began to admire her in secret, perhaps feeling that this young woman, despised by her father, still had an enormous role to play. And do you know what's even more curious? When the throne finally began to shake, it was Elizabeth who gained strength again. What would you do if you knew that your own sister, a powerful queen, could have you arrested, or worse, killed, at any moment? It was precisely in this tension that Elizabeth lived her final years before ascending the throne. After the death of young King Edward VI, Elizabeth's half-brother, the kingdom collapsed. Edward was only a teenager when he died, and had left a will attempting to prevent his sisters Mary and Elizabeth from inheriting the throne. This opened the way for a violent political struggle, and for a few days, another young woman, Lady Jane Grey, was even declared queen. But the people refused. The one who actually took over was Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's eldest daughter with Catherine of Aragon. Mary was a fanatical Catholic, determined to reverse all the Protestant reforms her father had initiated. And that's when things got really complicated for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, though raised Anglican, tried to remain neutral. But at court, neutrality is weakness. Rumors quickly began to spread that she was the center of a Protestant conspiracy to overthrow Mary, and as the Queen herself was paranoid and suspicious, it didn't take long for her to order her sister's arrest. Yes, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same place where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been beheaded. Imagine the terror this young woman in her early 20s felt as she walked through those stone gates, knowing her own mother's tragic fate and fearing she would be next. There were months of uncertainty, interrogations and isolation. Elizabeth became ill and weak, but still maintained her self-control. She responded intelligently, without falling into traps, and time, once again, played in her favor. Due to the lack of concrete evidence, Mary decided to release her, but kept her under surveillance. From then on, Elizabeth's every step was measured, every word was carefully chosen. She understood that she had to survive until destiny called her, and in 1558, the unexpected happened. Mary Tudor died without leaving any heirs. Behold, the young woman who had been rejected, imprisoned, accused of treason, became the next Queen of England. But don't think it was an easy coronation. Many doubted her abilities. Others feared she was weak, easily influenced, or even a heretic. Elizabeth arrived on the throne surrounded by suspicious glances, and yet she ascended with a firm posture, wearing a golden gown and a crown that seemed to weigh as much as the history she carried on her shoulders. On the day of her coronation, January 15, 1559, a crowd gathered in London, and there she was. The rejected daughter, the discarded heir, the woman no one thought could succeed. Now she was the absolute Queen of England, but reigning would not be easy. The country was broken, divided between Catholics and Protestants, with external enemies and internal distrust. And the people wanted to know, who was this young woman? Could she truly rule? Well, that's where the Golden Age begins. As soon as Elizabeth assumed the throne, a question began to echo in the corridors of the court, in the squares, and even in letters sent by foreign ambassadors. Who will she marry? After all, in 1558, a woman on the throne without a husband seemed politically absurd. The world, especially the world of men, believed that no woman could rule alone. A king was necessary, a husband who made decisions, a man who controlled the queen. But Elizabeth I had other ideas. She was young, beautiful, intelligent, and of course, one of the best matches in Europe. Several suitors appeared, princes of France, dukes of Austria, nobles of Spain, even the King of Spain himself. Philip II, who had been married to her sister Mary Tudor, tried to win the new queen over, but Elizabeth rejected them all. And the more she refused, the more the mystery grew. Why didn't she get married? Was it fear? Strategy? Was there some hidden love? The truth is that Elizabeth understood the political game like few others. She knew that marriage would make her vulnerable. Any husband who assumed the throne would share power, or worse, try to dominate her. And she did not want to be dominated. What's more, she had grown up watching the collapse of several royal marriages. She had seen her mother executed. She had seen her sister Maria suffer in her marriage to Philip II of Spain. She knew that love at court was often just a facade, and that poorly chosen alliances could cost the throne or one's head. Instead, Elizabeth used the prospect of marriage as a diplomatic weapon. When it was in England's interest to maintain good relations with a kingdom, she would hint at the possibility of marrying a prince from that country. She would charm the nobles, get their hopes up, and then back off. It was as if she was saying, "Yes, I can marry you, if it is good for my people." And among all the male figures around her, there was one who stood out. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Handsome, charismatic, and Elizabeth's childhood friend, many people at the time believed the two were having a secret affair. Some even said she wanted to marry him, but that it would be too much of a scandal, as Dudley was married. and his wife died under mysterious circumstances. It was a rumor that haunted Elizabeth for decades, but she never entered into any relationship. In public, she maintained the image of a pure woman, dedicated to the kingdom and the people. That is why she earned the nickname that would last for centuries: the Virgin Queen. The Virgin Queen. And the most impressive thing, this title became a symbol of power. Elizabeth came to be seen as married to England. Her body, her mind, her life, all dedicated to the throne. No scandals, no children vying for inheritances. Just her, alone at the top. But of course, this kind of attitude has a price. Would it be possible to keep the throne as a woman, without heirs, and with an entire Europe trying to overthrow her? Being queen wasn't enough. Elizabeth knew this. She was surrounded by enemies, spied on from within the court, and tested at every decision. And what made her one of the most feared and respected monarchs of her time wasn't physical strength or romantic alliances, it was her brains. From a young age, Elizabeth demonstrated an impressive thirst for knowledge. As a child, she mastered Latin and Greek. Before adolescence, she was already reading philosophy fluently and could write diplomatic letters in French and Spanish. And these weren't simple letters. No, they were sharp political texts, ready to charm or intimidate their readers. She was educated by some of England's finest tutors, including Roger Ascham, one of the era's greatest intellectuals. But it wasn't just what she learned, it was how she absorbed and applied it. Elizabeth studied, not out of obligation, but as if each new word were a stone in the castle she was building within herself. And that made all the difference. While many monarchs delegated decisions and stuck to parties and hunting, Elizabeth attended councils, read reports, wrote speeches, and debated face-to-face with nobles, ambassadors, and generals. She knew what she was talking about, and she knew exactly what she wanted to hear from others. What's more, she had a sharp memory. She remembered names, faces, dates, and every word spoken in previous audiences. It wasn't uncommon to see diplomats leaving meetings in a cold sweat, having underestimated the girl on the throne. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Elizabeth's intelligence was her strategic ability. She saw the throne as a chessboard, and each piece, whether an English lord, a foreign king, or a papal messenger, was carefully studied. She never acted impulsively. She calculated the impact of every gesture, every speech, even the clothes she wore. In times of religious war, a cross necklace could represent support for Catholics. A stylized crown in a portrait could be a silent response to a political enemy. Everything had a meaning. Everything was communication. Elizabeth didn't need to shout to dominate. She thought, and she made others think about her for days. This intelligence also attracted the best advisors. One of the most important was William Cecil, Lord Burghley, who had served her for decades and helped maintain the balance of the kingdom. But even he knew, the Queen always had the last word, and when asked how she managed to deal with so many powerful men around her, she responded with disarming calm. "I'm not afraid of lions, I am the lion." But even lions need protection from hunters, and in Elizabeth's case the hunters came from all directions: kings, spies, conspirators, even the church itself. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, England was a fragmented, poor, and discredited country. Internally, the people were divided between Catholics and Protestants, living in constant tension. Externally, England was perceived as a weak country, lagging behind the powers of continental Europe. Elizabeth's mission seemed impossible, but it was precisely there that the brilliance of his reign was born. And not just any brilliance, it was a true spectacle of fire, art, war, and grandeur. Elizabeth didn't just rule, she transformed England. With a combination of intelligence, determination, and far-sightedness, she initiated a process that would lead to her reign being known as the Golden Age, or, as it has been immortalized, the Elizabethan Age. Under her rule, trade flourished. By supporting maritime expeditions, Elizabeth encouraged the English to sail beyond their known borders. Explorers such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh became national heroes, bringing back riches and laying the foundations of what would become the British Empire. At the same time, the arts were reborn. Never before has theatre been so important. It was during this period that names such as Christopher Marlowe, and of course William Shakespeare emerged. The plays staged at the Globe theatres were not just entertainment, they were instruments of culture, social criticism, and in many cases political propaganda disguised as poetry. And Elizabeth understood this. She supported the arts as a state strategy. Her image was constantly portrayed in theatrical paintings, loaded with symbols of power, the serpent of wisdom, the globe in her hands, the crown with pearls as a sign of purity. She was more than a queen, she was a living legend. And there was another detail. England remained at peace for much of her reign. In a Europe torn apart by religious wars, Elizabeth managed to maintain balance, not through weakness, but through skill. She knew exactly when to retreat and when to show her teeth. His administration also strengthened the economy. New manufacturing, shipping incentives, trade agreements with other countries, all of this generated jobs and gave the people something they hadn't felt in a long time. But of course, not everything was rosy in this golden age. Poverty still existed, as did hunger. There were internal uprisings and climate crises that affected the harvest. But what made Elizabeth stand out was her ability to maintain stability even in the face of chaos. She faced rebellions, betrayals, epidemics, and remained steadfast, as if the throne itself was sewn to her body, and perhaps deep down she was, because Elizabeth was the personification of England, and England came to see itself in her. But the tranquility would not last forever. An enemy was growing silently across the Channel. Spain, the world's largest empire at the time, was beginning to see Elizabeth as a real threat. And when this giant decided to attack, Elizabeth would have to prove that her crown was not just decoration. If you think governing means sitting on a throne and issuing orders with a royal air, forget it. In Elizabeth's case, governing meant surviving. Every day, with every suspicious glance, every intercepted letter, every prayer against her existence. Elizabeth I was a Protestant. This in itself was a huge problem in a Europe dominated by Catholicism. The Church of Rome saw her as a heretic. The Pope even publicly excommunicated her, declaring that any Catholic could and should remove her from the throne. And worse, whoever killed her would still gain points with God. Can you imagine the atmosphere? She slept surrounded by guards. She never ate anything that hadn't been tested. She didn't trust anyone completely. Fear was part of her routine, but fear never paralyzed Elizabeth. It only made her sharper. Within England itself, Catholics were still numerous. Many of them saw Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, as the true heir to the English throne. Mary was Catholic, of Tudor blood, and most dangerously, was constantly sending suspicious messages to English nobles. Her name appeared in several plots to kill Elizabeth, and these weren't small conspiracies. They were international plots supported by Spain, France, and traitorous English nobles. Secret letters were written in codes, passed by disguised messengers, and hidden inside wine barrels. Elizabeth, of course, set up a spy network led by a genius, Sir Francis Walsingham. It was he who uncovered one of the greatest conspiracies against the Queen, the Babington Plot, where it was proven that Mary Stuart supported a plan to assassinate Elizabeth. And so, with a heavy heart but a steady head, Elizabeth signed her own cousin's death warrant. Mary was beheaded in 1587. It was a very tough decision. Elizabeth knew it could lead to war, but she also knew that living surrounded by snakes is too dangerous for someone who hesitates to crush one. And it didn't take long for the side effect to arrive. In 1588, Philip II of Spain, a Catholic and ultra-conservative king, decided to put an end to what he considered a Protestant usurper. He organized a huge war fleet, the infamous Armada Invincible, and sent his ships to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, and forcibly restore Catholicism. It was the most powerful empire in the world, against an island considered small, poor, and divided. The advisors were terrified, but Elizabeth didn't tremble. She personally went to her soldiers at Tilbury, mounted on a white horse, dressed in armor, and there, before the army, she said the phrase that would become a landmark in history. "I know I have the weak and fragile body of a woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." The crowd went wild. The English spirit was awakened. And do you know what happened? The Invincible Armada was defeated. The English, with smaller, more agile ships combined with a timely storm, dismantled Spanish pride. England survived. Elizabeth won, but the war, the conspiracy, the espionage, none of that ended. The throne remained a chair surrounded by blades. And at the center of this chaos, a queen who refused to fall. Imagine living with a constant shadow behind you, a shadow with your blood, your name, and even your destiny. Someone who seems born solely to take your place. Such was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, to Elizabeth I of England. The two were cousins, but they were far from living a family story. Quite the opposite. They represented opposing sides in a larger war. Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, Mary, the Catholic queen. One ruled with calculation, the other with passion. One wielded diplomacy as her sword, the other preferred alliances and marriages. And both had a legitimate claim to the throne of England. Mary Stuart was born to shine. Since she was a baby, she was promised the throne of France. She married young and became Queen of France and Scotland at the same time. She was beautiful, cultured, and full of charm, a woman made for the ballroom. But royal life was not a ballroom. Her French husband died early. She returned to Scotland to find a divided, turbulent country hostile to her Catholic faith. She married again, this time to a nobleman named Lord Darnley, who turned out to be a walking disaster, arrogant, jealous, and out of control. Worse still, he was mysteriously murdered in 1567 in a brutal attack that destroyed his home. Shortly thereafter, Mary married the prime suspect, the Earl of Bothwell. It was the last straw. The people revolted, the nobility turned against her. Mary was arrested by her own subjects and forced to abdicate the Scottish throne in favour of her son, the young James VI. Having fled Scotland, she sought refuge in England, in the home of her cousin Elizabeth. But what she found was not shelter, it was prison. Elizabeth received Mary with suspicion. She knew Mary was dangerous. As long as she lived, English Catholics would have an alternative to the throne. Mary was a symbol, and symbols, when they inspire rebellion, are more lethal than armies. That's why Elizabeth kept her in prison for 19 years. That's right. Almost 2 decades in castles, secluded mansions, and guarded rooms. Mary wrote letters, embroidered, and said Mass. But she also schemed. She secretly corresponded with Catholic sympathizers in England and abroad. Some of these letters were intercepted by Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's chief spy, and among them was what everyone feared: proof that Mary knew about and approved a plot to kill Elizabeth. The so-called Babington plot, uncovered in 1586, was the final straw. Mary had written, in her own handwriting, that she would support her cousin's murder and take the throne with Spain's help. Elizabeth hesitated. A lot, executing a queen, her cousin, no less, was unprecedented. She was afraid of the international backlash, afraid of becoming a Catholic martyr, afraid of appearing cruel, but at the same time she knew, if I don't kill her, she'll kill me. After long debates, divided councils, and sleepless nights, Elizabeth signed Mary Stuart's death warrant. And on 8 February 1587, Mary was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. They say she ascended the scaffold with dignity. She wore red, the colour of Catholic martyrdom, and murmured prayers in Latin. Before she died, she said that she was dying as a queen, a woman, and a martyr of the faith. Elizabeth was devastated. She cried. She isolated herself. She even said she didn't want Mary dead, and that she had signed the sentence under duress. But the fact is, the only woman who truly threatened her throne was no more. It was the end of one of the most painful stories between two queens. But it was not the end of the threat to England. Philip II of Spain, furious at Mary's execution, was preparing an unprecedented attack on English soil. And now, Elizabeth would have to face the greatest military power on the planet. Imagine the sound of church bells ringing in alarm, the smell of smoke from ships on the horizon, and an entire people, isolated, waiting for the worst. It was 5088, and the enemy was finally coming. Philip II of Spain, furious over the death of Mary Stuart, and dissatisfied with the growth of Protestant power in England, decided to act. He was the king of the largest empire in the world. Spain dominated the seas, the colonies, the gold of the Americas, and the blessing of the Pope. Philip saw Elizabeth not as a legitimate queen, but as a heretical usurper. And so he planned an unprecedented offensive, a gigantic armada with over 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, and 18,000 soldiers. Its name, the Invincible Armada. The plan was simple and terrifying. Spanish ships would cross the English Channel, rendezvous with the Spanish army stationed in the Netherlands, cross the sea, and invade England. It would be the end of Elizabeth's reign, the end of Protestant England, the beginning of a new Catholic era. The councillors trembled, the nobles doubted. But Elizabeth did not hide. She travelled to Tilbury, where the English army waited with worn swords and rusty armour, and there, mounted on a white horse, with a silver doublet over her dress, she made a speech that would echo forever. "I come to you, not as a queen, but as a warrior. I know I have the frail body of a woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England." Those words set the people's spirits ablaze. Elizabeth was not just a monarch. She became, before everyone, the soul of the nation. And then, the battle began. As the Invincible Armada approached, the English, with smaller, lighter ships, and led by bold commanders like Francis Drake, launched an attack. They used creative tactics, sending fire ships against the Spanish fleet at night, breaking up formations and cutting lines of communication. But there was another powerful ally on England's side: the weather. A brutal storm hit the English Channel. Ferocious winds swept Spanish ships away, smashed vessels against rocks, and prevented them from rendezvousing with the army on land. What was supposed to be a successful invasion turned into a disaster. More than half the fleet was destroyed. Thousands of Spaniards died. The Invincible Armada was defeated. Elizabeth didn't just survive, she triumphed. And more than that, she cemented her image as a queen chosen by God, protected by the forces of nature and guided by a unique intelligence. After the victory, medals were minted with the Latin phrase, "God breathed," and they were scattered. From that moment on, no one dared to doubt Elizabeth. The woman who was born rejected, grew up discarded, ascended to the throne under suspicion, was now the invincible queen. But with fame came the responsibility of keeping England united. And Elizabeth would let nothing slip through her fingers, not even her own image. If today we live in the age of social media, where every post, every selfie and every caption is carefully thought out to make an impact, then we can safely say Elizabeth I was the first influencer in history. She understood, before any other monarch, that power was not sustained only by laws, swords or crowns, but by something even more powerful: the image, the perception, the narrative. Elizabeth controlled every detail of how the people saw her, and it wasn't just vanity, it was state strategy. Her face, for example, was never depicted with wrinkles or signs of aging. Even as the years passed, official paintings continued to depict a young, serene, almost divine queen. She ordered the destruction of portraits that were unflattering. Only those that reinforced the legend circulated. She wore lavish clothing, with expensive fabrics and symbolic embroidery. Colors and details were not chosen haphazardly. White to represent purity, red to assert royal authority, gold to show wealth and divine favor. And the jewelry, it was more than just adornment. It was a visual message. Pearl necklaces symbolized chastity. Golden scepters and orbs represented dominion. She was often depicted holding a globe to indicate that the world was within her reach. In other portraits, she was depicted with serpents and roses, symbols of wisdom and beauty. All of this formed a modern concept of personal marketing. Elizabeth was not just a woman, she was an idea, an entity. And she knew that in a male-led world, being perceived as almost mystical was a form of survival. She said she was married to England, but in practice she was married to the very myth she had created. In fact, there's a famous portrait, the Armada portrait, where Elizabeth II appears standing imposingly, with her hand on a globe, ships in the background, and an icy visage. This painting was painted shortly after the victory over Spain. Every element in it was designed to tell the world, "I am invincible. I am eternal. I am England. And it wasn't just in paintings. Elizabeth also mastered public speaking. Her speeches were carefully crafted, with powerful sentences, emotional pauses, and a theatrical presence. When she spoke in public, people were moved. They cried. They gave her a standing ovation. She even controlled her personal life as a member of the state. She never clearly revealed her feelings for Robert Dudley or any other suitor. She maintained an air of mystery. She fueled rumors, but never confirmed anything. And this kept everyone interested, watching, trying to decipher. Elizabeth, in many ways, created the formula for what we now call personal branding. She was the very brand of the English monarchy. And this wasn't just vanity, it was protection. At a time when alliances could crumble with a single bit of gossip, she took control of her own narrative. But even with all this strength and immaculate image, the years passed, and no matter how much the portraits tried to freeze her youth, time did not forgive, and the golden curtains began to hide loneliness, regrets, and silent fears. While kings waged war and nobles conspired behind the scenes of power, something magical was happening in the streets, squares, and stages of England. A silent revolution, made of words, music, and emotion. England under Elizabeth's reign wasn't just marked by battles and diplomacy. It was, above all, a boiling cultural melting pot, where art gained unprecedented importance and where one of the greatest names in world literature emerged, William Shakespeare. But let's start with the environment. During Elizabeth's reign, English society was changing. As trade grew, more people had access to education, cities grew, a new social class emerged, the bourgeoisie, who wanted more than just to survive. They wanted to feel, think, and be moved. And the Queen knew this. Elizabeth was a cultured woman, passionate about poetry, music, and theatre. From a young age, she wrote verses and read Latin classics. And as a good strategist, she understood the political value of art. After all, nothing connects people more than a good story. This is how she opened up space for culture to flourish like never before. She sponsored artists, allowed the construction of theatres, something that was previously frowned upon by the church, and protected playwrights who dared to criticize, satirize, or move with their texts. Into this fertile landscape emerged William Shakespeare. The son of a glovemaker from Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare arrived in London with a thirst for the stage and poetry. He began writing historical plays, such as Henry VI's, and quickly gained attention for his ability to speak to the hearts of the people and the nobility. Elizabeth attended several of his plays, and although she rarely attended public theatres, she received private performances at the palace. She liked his strong stories, intelligent female characters, and lines full of double meanings. She saw something familiar in Shakespeare, a mind that understood the power of images, words, and emotional manipulation. And Shakespeare, in turn, drew inspiration from the Queen herself. Many of his heroines, like the bold Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, or the strong-willed Catherine in The Taming of the Shrew, carried Elizabethan traits: intelligence, sharp tongue, independence. Shakespeare's plays went beyond entertainment. They questioned power, laughed at politics, explored love, jealousy, death, and betrayal. All this at a time when theatre was the cinema of the time, a vibrant, collective spectacle where rich and poor came together to feel together. But it wasn't just Shakespeare. Other names shone in the Elizabethan era: Christopher Marlowe with his dark tragedies, Ben Jonson with his sharp satires, Thomas Tallis and William Byrd with their musical compositions that enchanted churches and drawing rooms. Elizabeth reigned not only over lands, but over minds and hearts. She created the ideal environment for England to cease being just a nation and become a cultural reference for the world. And even in the most difficult times of famine, plague, or war, the theatre continued. The music did not stop. The art did not fall silent, because deep down, the people felt that as long as Elizabeth was on the throne, there was something eternal, beautiful, and firm sustaining the country. But behind this queen of letters and stages, there was also a lonely woman. As the years passed, the young faces around her grew old or died. The applause grew more distant. And she, the Virgin Queen, began to face the greatest challenge of all, time. When we think of Elizabeth I, It is easy to imagine that imposing figure in the portraits, her face pale as porcelain, her red hair arranged like a flaming crown, her golden dress, heavy, as if her body were made of power. But behind that almost heavenly appearance, there was a woman of flesh, blood, and strategy. Elizabeth knew that, as a woman, being underestimated was inevitable, and so she learned to use that underestimation to her advantage. She let people think she was just cute, fragile, delicate, and while the men discussed among themselves who would influence her the most, she had already decided what she would do. Elizabeth ruled like an invisible maestro, directing chaos with steady hands and measured words, and when necessary, she literally. On several occasions, she ordered the public executions of traitors, including close nobles, advisors, priests, and even the Archbishop of York himself. If anyone threatened her throne, or even seemed to doubt her authority, Elizabeth acted without hesitation. But the most impressive thing is that she did not lose her elegance. She did not shout. She did not make a fuss. Her strength was in her calm gaze, her firm voice, her silent decision that everyone knew. If you cross the line, there is no going back. She was also brilliant at political maneuvering. She often made ambiguous promises, let her advisors think they were in control, and then, in the end, acted behind the scenes and surprised everyone. Elizabeth had an impressive memory. She knew everything each nobleman had said to her years before. She remembered old alliances, small, hidden betrayals, false smiles. She knew who was who, and who could fall. And what about men? She didn't let anyone cross her line. Robert Dudley, her favorite, lived in the Queen's shadow for decades, but she never gave in completely. All other suitors were tested, manipulated, rejected, or used as diplomatic pawns. Elizabeth was the center of everything, and she made sure the world knew it. And what's more, she was a master of silence. If something serious happened, she waited, she watched, and then she acted. It was said at court that an enemy's greatest fear was to be ignored by Elizabeth, because if she didn't react, it was because she was preparing something bigger. And when she was betrayed, she didn't cry in public. She turned her pain into steel. With her, forgiveness was rare, and mercy strategic. But this firmness came at a cost. As the years passed, Elizabeth became more and more isolated. She trusted almost no one. She kept people at a distance. She even had members of her own family arrested and exiled when she sensed the slightest sign of conspiracy. Some said she was cold, others said she was lonely. But the truth is, Elizabeth carried the weight of wearing a crown in a place the world didn't want her to be. She might seem fragile, but her will was unbreakable. If you think today's reality shows are confusing, you've clearly never heard of Elizabeth I's court. The Queen's court was a living spectacle of drama, tension, intrigue, and passion, where every gesture, every exchange of glances, every silence could mean the beginning of a political war or the end of a reputation. The Queen ran the palace as if she were a theatre director. The nobles, ambitious actors vying for attention, favours, power. But there was one name that shone brightest among them all. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Dudley was not just another lord. He was the favourite, handsome, charismatic, well-spoken, with a history of friendship with Elizabeth since their youth. They had known each other since before the crown. They had laughed together, studied together, grown up together, and when Elizabeth became queen, he never left her side. On the contrary, he became her confidant, her shadow, her safe haven, and in the eyes of many, her great love. But there was a problem. Dudley was married, and his wife, Amy Robsart, died under suspicious circumstances, falling down a flight of stairs, alone, in her home. The scandal was immediate. Many people thought the death was staged so that Dudley could marry the Queen. Elizabeth denied any involvement, and afraid of losing her reputation, she refused the marriage. Even though her heart told her otherwise, still, Dudley remained close by. He was given positions, titles, and lands. Elizabeth said, "I put him wherever I want, because I trust only him." But the court watched everything as if watching a soap opera live. Rumors ran wild in the corridors. There were rivalries, jealousies, hidden alliances. Other ladies-in-waiting to the Queen fell in love with Dudley. One of them, Lettice Knollys, dared to marry him secretly. When Elizabeth found out, her fury was total. She banished Lettice from court forever. The woman who dared to steal the Queen's man never set foot in the palace again. But Elizabeth would not stop. Even with her heart broken, she held firm to her command. Other men came close, like Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, nearly 30 years her junior, impetuous, handsome and fearless. The Queen treated him like a son, or perhaps something more. But he was too rebellious. Essex tried to lead a revolt against the Queen herself. Elizabeth, cold and ruthless, ordered his execution. Yes, she ordered the beheading of the man who had once kissed her hand as a sign of love. The drama was constant. Every entrance to court was measured. A misinterpreted look could mean exile. A badly spread rumor could cost one's head. And yet, everyone wanted to be there. Because Elizabeth's court was the center of the world. Among red carpets, golden mirrors, and shiny dresses, there were broken hearts, envious eyes and treacherous mouths hidden. And in the midst of it all, the Queen held her place, alone on the throne, untouchable, unforgettable, but time that no one rules forever. And little by little, the mirror began to show a paler, more fragile image. The Queen, who had resisted everything, began to feel the weight of eternity. After more than 4 decades on the throne, the woman who was once the young redhead full of vigor, who rode horses, gave speeches in armor, and faced empires, now walked with a slower pace. The shine of jewels continued. The dresses were still imposing, but the eyes were emptier. Elizabeth I had reached the end of the road. Her reign, which began in 1558, lasted 44 years. She was no longer just a queen. She was a living legend, a symbol of stability for a people who only knew her face as a reference for government. Entire generations had been born under her authority. She had stood through time like a beacon, and now that beacon was beginning to fade. The last few years were difficult. Her main advisors had died. Robert Dudley, her beloved friend and companion for decades, died in 1588. She kept his last letter until the end of her life in a velvet box by her bed. The war, which she had won with such glory, also left scars. The economy went into crisis. The plague once again ravaged villages. Culture remained alive, but the court was colder, quieter, without the same fervor as before, and Elizabeth was silent. In recent years, she had refused to look at herself in the mirror. She, who had taken such great care of her image, now avoided the reflection. Time had won. The wrinkles, previously hidden under layers of white powder, became visible even through the masks. She slept badly. She ate little. She spent hours sitting in silence, refusing even to lie down, as if lying down would mean accepting the end, as if falling asleep would allow the world to go on without her. Doctors tried to comfort her. The nobles pressured her to name a successor, and she, with the same firmness as always, resisted. But in March 1603, her body finally gave out. Elizabeth I died at the age of 69 at Richmond Palace, shrouded in silence, mourned reverently, and finally laid to rest. She had refused to have a husband, children, or direct heirs. But even so, she left a legacy that would echo for centuries. With her death, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. But a new era was born, the era she herself had prepared. Before she died, she appointed James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, the same cousin she had executed, as her successor. Irony? Redemption? Final strategy? Only history can answer. His body was buried in Westminster Abbey, and the tombstone reads, "The memory of a queen without equal." And it is true, Elizabeth I was without equal. She ruled as a woman, in a world made for men. She led with intelligence, resisted with dignity, and died as a symbol of an entire nation. But even after the end, his presence never left. Because true power is what remains even when the body is no longer here. Queens and kings come and go. Many shine for a moment and fade away with time, swallowed up by the history books. But Elizabeth I was never forgotten. More than 4 centuries after her death, her name is still spoken with reverence. Her image still graces books, television series, films, statues, and coins. She is not just remembered, she is studied, celebrated, interpreted, and debated. Because what Elizabeth built was much greater than a reign. It was a legacy. She proved that power has no gender. At a time when women were treated like property, she reigned alone. Without a husband, without children, without asking permission. Her life was a constant denial of the expectations imposed on her. She didn't marry. She wasn't submissive. She wasn't forgotten. She showed that the throne is not defined by who sits on it, but by how one stays on it. And she remained for 44 years. Solid, strategic, cunning, loved and feared in equal measure. Under her leadership, England went from being a peripheral nation to an emerging power. She planted the seeds of the British Empire. She shaped the spirit of English nationalism. She united the country through art, intelligence, and diplomacy, not just swords. Elizabeth I was also responsible for allowing culture to explode like never before. During her reign, Shakespeare flourished, theatre became popular, and music gained soul. She understood that real power also lies in words, ideas, and symbols. Her image has become an archetype of leadership. Every time a woman assumes a position of power, be it a president, a minister, a CEO, Elizabeth's haughty shadow walks nearby. It lives in schools, in palaces, in literature, in cinema. It lives in every woman who dares to think for herself. It lives in every person who defies the destiny imposed on them. And perhaps that is why, even centuries later, we still stop to listen to her story. Because Elizabeth I was not just a queen, she was a phenomenon. And like every true phenomenon, it never dies. It just changes form. If you've made it this far, take a deep breath and comment, "Long live the Queen." Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, like and share this video with someone who loves history. Because telling the past is reliving who we were and understanding who we are. And Elizabeth will continue to teach us for many ages to come.